Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Bazaar Morning Call. I'm Lata, with me Anuj and Sonia, and you may wonder that we, all three of us, are 10 minutes too early on Bazaar, and that's because we are welcoming a very important guest, a long-time watcher of the Indian skies and the man who invented the word, actually, emerging markets. We are referring to Mark Mobius, founding partner, Mobius Capital Partners, but of course, for a long time, the fund manager at Templeton. Good morning, Mr. Mobius. It's a pleasure having you with us. Thank you very much for joining us on what are very important days for us, because a government with an extraordinarily large political capital is going to present its first budget. So really, that's the first question to you. What are your expectations from the Modi government in its second term?
Well, my expectations are very good, particularly since a woman is going to be in charge. Okay. I think a woman can make all the good changes that have to be made. And I think the most important, as far as I'm concerned, is two things. One, infrastructure, and two, jobs. Jobs for the agricultural sector. And I believe that hopefully the new government will introduce changes that will encourage more infrastructure spending, and of course that will produce more jobs for people in the rural sector.
Mr. Mobius, good morning. That's the big question, right? If you look at the Indian market, it's been very bipolar. The broader market has seen a big bear market. Do you think budget can do anything to change the sentiment around that and lead to a decent rally?
Yes, I do think they can do a number of things. Of course, as I mentioned, first is really boost infrastructure spending in a big way. I'm not just talking of small increments. I'm talking about 20, 30, 40% increase in the budget for infrastructure, and also encourage those projects that will bring rural employment into those big projects. The other thing the government can do is continue to lower interest rates. That would be very, very good. And of course, not worrying too much about the deficit. I mean, you can go, right now it's what, 3.5% of GDP? You can go up to 5% with no problem at all. So I think there are a number of things that the government can do now that will really boost the economy. Interestingly enough, the stock market seems to be quite optimistic about it. Yeah. As you know, it's doing pretty well, and the exchange rate is improving. So obviously there are people out there who believe good things will come from the budget.
Oh, absolutely. Mark, hi, good morning. In fact, the MSCI India index is up about 9% this year already. I'll come to that in a bit, but before that, you spoke about the measures that the government could undertake to boost infrastructure. This will, of course, come at the cost of the fisc. So there is a thought that in this budget, the focus will be more on fiscal expansion rather than fiscal prudence. Will that be taken well by foreign investors?
I believe so, if it's done in the right way, in the right direction. I think you have to do two things. Of course, boost spending for infrastructure. But the second thing you've got to do is also introduce more privatization of state-owned enterprises and projects. You must remember, a lot of the infrastructure, such as toll roads, bridges, that sort of thing, could be done by the private sector under the right conditions. And I think this is something the government can do that will speed up the productivity of the infrastructure sector.
Okay. Mark, I want to revisit what you are expecting by way of plans and policies or programs from the budget itself. But just a word first on the global scenario. Yields are falling like no tomorrow. While, of course, US yields are at 2016 levels at 1.95. Yesterday, the Reserve Bank of Australia took its policy rate to even below Lehman time levels. Likewise, German bond yields have been falling to historic lows pierced even from levels that we saw during Lehman times. What's happening? Are you really worried about the global economy?
Well, you know, Australia has benefited from a big trade surplus, as you know, and that has helped them a lot. But I believe, generally speaking, because of what's happening in the U.S., the growth in the U.S. has been very, very good. Now, how long it will last is another question, but at 3% or so, it's a very, very strong economy, and that affects the global economy, despite all the trade problems that we've been talking about. I do believe the Chinese and the Americans will come to some interim agreement, but I hope that India can take advantage of this and hopefully get some of the Chinese business over to India, again, to attack the employment problem.
Okay, no, so basically, what are you penciling in by way of rate cuts is what I was asking, because of the way the global bond yield markets have been functioning.
Well, that's why I believe that the rates in India can be cut further, much further. Don't forget, in Europe, the euro is at negative rates.
Yeah.
People have to pay the bank to keep their money in the bank. It's just insane. The whole situation is very crazy. And as you know, the Bank of Japan continues to buy ETFs in order to boost the economy with really not much effect. So interest rates globally are headed down, which is great for India.
Okay, Mark, I remember you were in India last time when we had this recapitalization for state-owned banks, and we had discussed that in our last interview as well. There are reports of, one more recapitalization program. Do you think that would be a good move, and do you think that would lead to perhaps some money moving towards state-owned banks?
Yes, I think that will probably happen. I'm not too keen on it, though, because I'd rather see that money go into projects, infrastructure projects, which actually, in an indirect way, will help the banks, because those companies, infrastructure companies, construction companies, will get business, and they'll be able to pay back the banks and take care of some of the bad loans that they have with the banks. So I'd rather have that direction rather than direct support of the banks.
Okay, we'll come back to the budget in a bit, but before that, for the rest of the year, what are you factoring in terms of a growth for both emerging markets as well as for India? Because so far this year, it's been about a 9 to 11% growth, not bad for both the MSCI Emerging Market Index and India. But what's the prognosis henceforth?
Well, the good news is that with U.S. interest rates headed down, at least that's what most people believe, that's terrific for emerging markets. Because usually when interest rates in America go down, emerging markets go up. That's number one. Number two is there are a number of markets where, India is one example, where governments are coming in who are intent on reform. Brazil is another. Turkey is changing very rapidly. So you're in a situation where, okay, we're not going to see the results immediately, but a year from now or 2 years from now, you're going to see the results of these reforms, which will be very good for the markets. And of course, as you know, markets go ahead of what is going to happen. In other words, markets look forward at least a year. And probably that's why you're seeing strengthening as well because of the U.S. interest rates, the index for emerging markets going up.
Okay. Well, Mark, what are you buying in India now?
Right now, we're looking at, believe it or not, the non-bank financial organizations.
Oh, okay.
For one, we're looking at manufacturers. We're looking at manufacturers because we believe that, by the way, very selectively, I must say.
Okay.
But for the other areas in industry, we like companies that are related to infrastructure. So any companies producing pipes, cables, anything like that is very interesting to us.
What's attracting you to the non-bank finance companies?
I believe there's some particular ones. I know there are a number that are in trouble, but there are some that are doing quite well in the face of this difficult environment.
Yes.
And of course, with interest rates headed down, they're going to be in a very good shape to service their customers and also minimize bad loans.
Mark, one sector in India which has gone through a terrible time over the last 1 year is automobile. It used to be one of the big sectors. Are you sensing any opportunities here, or do you think structurally perhaps things are now different and it won't be the kind of sector that it was, say, 5 or 6 years back?
It's going to be difficult, I believe, both for four-wheelers and two-wheelers. We're looking at some two-wheelers, but frankly, the competition is very intense, and there's so many technological changes, from gasoline to electric or hybrid. There's so many of these changes taking place. I think the companies are finding it difficult to keep up. and this is a big issue going forward as well. So I think it's an industry we have to look at. There will be demand, but I think particularly now it is difficult.
The one thing that the street will watch out for very closely is what noises the government would make to tackle the liquidity crisis that we've been hit with over the past 6 to 12 months. What do you think the government should do or can do to increase liquidity in the system, especially to boost, these cash-starved sectors like real estate, etc.?
Yeah, I think you've got a very good point. I think the GST has really impacted the small and medium-sized businesses. And that, of course, impacts liquidity generally, because if people are not buying and spending at that level, at the small and medium-sized enterprise level, it impacts the entire economy. So I think what they're going to have to do is try to streamline the GST collection process and also streamline the bureaucracy generally to make it much easier for these companies to operate with a minimum of paperwork.
Okay. Mark, more generally, are you also worrying about Indian valuations? We hear that talk several times.
Of course, we worry about valuations all the time. The good news is that with the growth that we're seeing in India, if you look forward, let's say you're looking at a 20 times PE today, in 2 or 3 years it may come down to 10 times, and that's what we're interested in. We're not so much interested in looking through the rearview mirror as to what the P's are now based on historic earnings, but what we can see going forward.
So you did start by saying that, foreign investors at this point in time are focusing more on governments that have a strong intent to come out with reforms, etc. Does India top your list? As far as I remember, it did. In your pecking order, India was high up there. But for the rest of the year, within the emerging market basket, how would you be positioned?
Well, even more so, I believe that with the win that Modi has in his belt, I think it means that he can do much more in terms of reform. So I would say, in some ways, India tops the list. You haven't had that kind of win for example, in Brazil. Bolsonaro he wants to reform, but he's got tremendous pressures from Congress in terms of what changes he wants to be made. And of course, you follow Argentina, that's a real difficult situation for Macri. So India is in a very good shape in this respect.
Okay, but Mark, the other issue with the Indian market, and in fact that's been a global trend, is that most of the money is chasing a set of 7 or 8 stocks. In India, it's been the HDFC stocks or the Bajaj stocks. Do you think we are creating a bit of a large cap bubble in India and perhaps across the globe as well?
It's a global problem because ETFs, exchange traded funds, now, I just saw a statistic the other day, represent about 70%, if you include index funds and ETFs, about 70% of the money going into the markets around the world, including the Indian market. So this is really an issue. This is the reason why we believe in more active management, and more large investors, large institutional investors, family offices are beginning to think that way as well.
Mark, what are your thoughts on this farm income transfer that's already underway? It was first an income transfer for small farmers, but post government taking office, it's expanded it to all farmers. Your view on that plan as well, what will that make you buy in terms of stocks?
Well, it's a good move temporarily. I believe it's a good temporary move to relieve the pressures because the farmers are hurting, and it's important for the government to do something. And it will help the consumption-oriented stocks. And already, as you know, they're pretty expensive, so it's difficult to find real good bargains in that space. Okay. But they'll be doing quite well as a result of that. But, as I said, really what they should be emphasizing for the farmers is jobs. Okay. Because we're seeing a movement globally, not only in India, from the farms to the urban areas, from rural to urban. And that's where we have to attack the employment problem.
Okay. Well, we discussed bang in the start of the chat about the fiscal deficit, and you said you won't even mind if it goes to 5%. actually the centre and the state governments together are going to do a gross borrowing of about 12 trillion rupees this year, and if you add the state-owned enterprises, it would come to something like 15 trillion. Now that's the total deposit growth in the country annually. Do you not fear that yields will go up?
No, I don't think it's going to be a problem if, and this is a big if, the money is spent in the right way, in the right projects. That's the key. And that's the reason why I think it has to be more joint government projects so that the private sector can be involved to make sure that it's productive and it pays for itself, so to speak. So I think that's very, very important.
Okay, one last question from my end then, Mark. I do want your thoughts on the NBFC space, because that's where the crisis began about 6 to 8 months ago. What are the announcements that you would expect? Because there's a lot of talk on, some sort of refinance support to MSMEs, access to long-term funding, perhaps relaxation of the FPI guidelines as well. I don't know how much fiscal headroom there is, but what would you expect to hear to solve this, crisis of sorts in the NBFC space?
Well, I think what you're going to see is probably a relaxation from the government to allow more space. In other words, more time for recovery. I think that would be helpful. And of course, there's the expectation of more funding of the banks, so that can help. But I believe at the end of the day, the growth of the Indian economy will take care of these problems. A year from now, assuming the government keeps on moving towards reform, and assuming the economy continues to grow at the pace they're growing, then all these problems will be wiped out. Of course, there'll be some tragedies. Some people will go to the wall, but generally speaking, it will work out okay.
Okay, where's India in your pecking order now? Emerging markets?
India is number one.
All right.
Still, we really believe in India.
Okay, great way to end the conversation. Mark Mobius, it's always a pleasure having you with us. Thank you very much for setting the ball rolling in terms of our economic survey and budget discussions. It gives us a high. Thank you very much for joining us.